So when people speak to us today of a person who was incarnated by Satan to be the Antichrist, there is no scriptural foundation. Today we're on to Revelation chapter 13 about the beast and the dragon. Again, it's about beasts. Beasts are monstrous things. They speak of something that's violent, like a lion, a beast. Well, in verse 1, it appears out of the sea, which is the abyss, or out of the nations. Quite often in the Bible, a sea is regarded as nations. And then again, there is this idea in that verse of the abyss, which of course is the place where Satan would be. But it's a beast. It doesn't say Satan. And it has 10 horns and 7 heads. And on its 10 horns were 10 diadems. Now this is similar to the description we dealt with in chapter 12. And there we said that, of course, it is the Roman Empire. The beast is the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire is under the control of Satan and under the control of his forces and other demonic forces that come from all that demonic world and principalities and powers under which this world is dominated. Well, it had 10 horns, and we dealt with 10 horns in chapter 12, and there we gave the idea that it was the 10 break-up parts of Rome that were done by the Gauls and the Vandals and so forth, the Visigoths and so forth. But during the week I came across something that I have not heard anybody else say, and which I tend to believe is the actual truth. There were 10 dynasties after the first one ended with Vespasian, and they continued until the breakup of the Roman Empire, having over each reign a Caesar, nothing to do with the church. Well, the other people who follow the 10 ones in Europe, they tend to want it to include the Roman Catholic Church. To me, there is no evidence of any Roman Catholic Church in the book of Revelation. There is no evidence or sign that the Pope is the Antichrist. In fact, in the book of Revelation, there is no the Antichrist. And then it has, on the horns were 10 diadems. And of course that speaks of authority and rule. And we'll deal with the fact that it's a beast. And this beast, on its head, had blasphemous names. That means that the beast itself was the source of the blasphemous names. What the beast stood for was full of blasphemy against the true God. And this beast, in verse 2, was like a leopard, feet like a bear's, mouth like a lion's mouth. And it reminds us of the beast of the images and their beasts of empires in Daniel chapter 2. Because there, Nebuchadnezzar in his dream had seen 4 empires, the first of gold, the Babylonian, then the silver, the Medes and Persians, after that the bronze, which was the Grecian and the Alexandrian. And after that, the legs of iron and his feet of iron and partly of clay, of course, was the Roman Empire. Now, some people have said that the legs were the divided kingdoms of Alexandria. It doesn't fit in. It's the Roman Empire. And the stone came, heavenly stone, and struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay. And in other words, it collapsed the legs. It collapsed the Roman Empire. There is the collapse of the Roman Empire that's foretold in the book of Revelation. And when John gives this description of the beast in verse 2 of chapter 13, first of all, it's a leopard. And a leopard speaks of something that really is cruel and puts forth its power by jumping, quite often from a tree, actually. And that indeed was Greece, as is portrayed further on in the book of Daniel. You get these four beasts in chapters 2, 7, and 8. And it was a bear, which were the Medes and Persians, and the Babylonians were the lion. Well, what happened was the characteristics that were in the former three empires were all found, aggregated and concentrated in the Roman Empire. The Rome itself had the feet of a bear. It was strengthened as a bear. It has the mouth of the lion. It could seize and hold its prey. And it sprang like a leopard. The Roman Empire is described as the most fearsome empire. And that's the empire that was in control when Jesus Christ was crucified. That's the empire that was in control when John had this revelation. It's the empire that was controlled when Israel and Jerusalem were finished by AD 70. In chapter 12 of the book of Revelation, verse 3, you will see that there were 7 heads, and they were forms of government, which I described as being the different ways in which the Roman Empire operated. And I still hold to that. But to me, the 10 horns are different. They are the 10 monarchies. Now, whatever it means, nobody is really certain. And I give forth my belief according to what I've read about everybody else's belief and how it fits in to the situation in the book of Revelation. The thing we need to understand is it's not vitally important to be able to describe every single thing we read about in the book of Revelation. We need to get the general picture. We need to understand the symbolism that brings forth a general picture. Now, the people in the 7 churches of Asia Minor already knew what the empire was like. They were living there. And so when John would bring this revelation to their mind via a letter, they certainly would be able to pick out the total symbolism that was represented by a certain thing. In this case, the beast. They would have been taught Daniel's vision because the apostles knew that the visions of Daniel related to Matthew 24 and Luke 21. They had listened to Jesus. And then they had the teaching of the Holy Ghost. Plus the fact that as followers of the Old Testament, they knew something of the book of Daniel for sure. Because all boys at the age of 12 were required to go to a religious school, and they were taught the stories of the Old Testament. And in those days they were probably taught the oral law as well. There's no record that all the apostles went there, but being Hebrews, being Judeans, they must have gone, because that's the normal thing for them to do according to what history says. And then we need to understand there's always a satanic spirit behind this beast. He stands upon the power of Satan. And in chapter 12, verse 3, where there was a great red dragon, that was not Satan. Dragons form a major part in the mythology, the demonology, and the idolatry of many of the ancient countries. For centuries, millennia, dragons or serpents had formed a basic belief in their mythology. Now we know their mythology was based on the actual falls of the angels and the history that is recorded in 1 Enoch and other books. And we know that their mythology has a relationship with the idolatry that they followed. And the idolatry they followed can be traced back to Nimrod and Babylon, and to the fallen angels, to the giants and the Nephilim. So those fallen angels actually became angels of worship when they came and took women to be their wives and consorts and prostitutes. So you have that all mixed up in ancient thinking. And a bit of this ancient thinking has been captured by John. After all, he was reared in it. Being a Judean, he was reared in it. It was taught all around. Whether he believed it or not is another matter. The thing was, it was prevalent teaching. It was prevalent understanding. And we need to understand that even in Palestine, and certainly in Asia Minor, the idolatry of the Roman Empire was such, they were surrounded by idols everywhere. There were temples to Caesars in Palestine and even in Jerusalem itself at the time of the writing of this book. We need to understand the background of all this. And I would like to say here, without a doubt, the beast is not Nero. The beast is the Roman Empire. Nero was one of the 7 heads, because he was one of those emperors who reigned from Julius Caesar until Vespasian, 7. Right now we'll talk about Nero. And now Nero was emperor number 6. Vespasian was number 7. They were the 7 emperors of the bloodline from Julius Caesar, coming down by the male and female. Then it ended. And the Flavian emperors commenced with Titus. Obviously Vespasian's wife did not have the bloodline. And there were many of those. Well, in relation to Nero, he's not the beast, because he's one of the heads, one of the he's one of the, one of the heads. And it says in verse 3, one of its heads, one of the heads of the beast, who is the Roman Empire, seemed to have received a death blow, but its mortal wound had been healed. In amazement, the whole earth followed the beast. There is a myth about Nero. He did die at his own hand in AD 68. But at that time, in the Gentile world, not in the church of Jerusalem, much of which had departed, not in the churches of Asia Minor, there was no myth about Nero in all those churches for the first 100 years. He was never described as an antichrist by the churches. He was never described as that figure, Antiochus Epiphanes of the Old Testament. He was never described like that. He was only described, as John said, by the churches. But nevertheless, in the Gentile world, within months almost of his death, there appeared a myth that he had appeared in Parthia, amongst the Persians to the east, and that he was alive, and that he was going to reappear again. Well, of course, it was a myth. They believed it. You tell me why? I really don't know. Now, this is recorded by many historians. It is a fact. And many of our preachers from the seminaries obviously have not studied the historians very deeply. Those who went to a kind of a Christian, like a Catholic university, probably did study it. And maybe many a Protestant university, like Cambridge and Oxford. The scholars of those places, they really know what they're talking about, and even if they disagree, they know the historical facts. And there is this about Nero, that already there was a myth about Antiochus Epiphanes. There was a myth about the fact that he was the anti-God person in Daniel chapter 11. Now, it was only a myth. Personally, I believe it speaks of Herod the Great, not Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, whether it does or doesn't is immaterial to what we're saying. The myth was there. And there was also this myth from ancient times of the dragon, and this person who ascended up into heaven and had a battle with God, or this being in heaven that had a battle with God and descended. Now, after Nero died, that myth became part of the Hellenistic Judaistic belief, never in the churches. So Christians today, and most of us, have got their information through pastors and their books and the seminaries, without really going to the historian and the historical scholars who tell us the actuality of these things. Nero was never an antichrist to the Christians of the first 100 years. And it didn't happen until after that. And well into the 2nd century, there began to appear the word Antichrist. Didn't exist before that. So when people speak to us today of a person who was incarnated by Satan to be the Antichrist, there is no scriptural foundation. There's no foundation in the early church. And we need to know this, because this is where most of the end-timers have gotten to. They're talking about the Antichrist all the time, looking for the Antichrist. There is no Antichrist at the end of the world as a figure who's predicted in Scripture. Then it says, the whole earth followed the beast. What the Roman Empire was doing, as empowered in their emperors, in Caesars, in the form of being worshipped, was so amazing that people said, this is a wonderful empire, not the Christians. They saw the glory of the empire. They saw the military conquest. They saw them fighting and winning. They saw them being defeated sometimes. They saw the wealth. They saw all the shipping that was going through the Mediterranean all the time. They were on the Silk Route that actually went down through Jerusalem and right through there, right to China, even in those days. There was great wealth, great commerce. And of course, when the Gentiles, who are not the Christians, and I might add, the Hellenistic Judaists, they got it too. When they saw this myth and heard this myth about Nero, they exceedingly thought, oh, this empire is marvelous. Look what's happening. Nero's going to come back. And they thought that for many a year. Verse 4, they worshipped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, who is like the beast, and who can fight against him? Well, we saw from Revelation 12, verse 3, that this red dragon was the religious part of the power of the Roman Empire. And here it is again. The religious part of the Roman Empire, and we detailed it last time, or a couple of lessons ago, had such power that it said, we want emperor worship to be continued, because it had begun with Augustus Caesar, who said he was Almighty God. After that, nearly every Caesar would make for himself the idols figuring himself, and they were spread all around the empire, and the people were required to worship. He had authority as Caesar to receive worship, and the authority was given from this religious body that we talked about a couple of lessons ago in the Roman Empire, who were of great power. If you remember, one of the 7 churches was that kind of a city where the great powers resided. And another one said where Satan's seat is. The seat was actually not in Rome, but in one of the cities of Asia Minor. So that part of the Roman Empire was qualified in its churches that it had, the 7 churches, to receive this letter and be able to understand it very clearly, because all these things went on around them. Now the Caesars were worshipped, and the highest god of the Roman Empire was the Caesar, and they had dozens of gods. I mean, Saturday, Saturn, Sunday, Thursday, Thor the god of war, and Woden the god of something else. I learned that at school and forget it. There were temples all over the Roman Empire, including Judea. And they would have been there at the time of Christ. There was a temple that honored Caesar on Temple Mount that was built in honor of Julius Caesar as being equivalent to God. Now, of course, these things are not disclosed in the Bible. The Bible is not about history. The New Testament is not about what went on in the Roman Empire, except the book of Revelation. And so we need to understand what did go on in the Roman Empire. If you've lived in a pagan society, you will surely understand it all the more, as we have done for many a year in India, the greatest pagan society that exists, with the largest number of people, with a Hinduism that is somewhat akin to Judaism. Now you really need to study these things if you want to know the real truth about them, which I have done. It takes many an hour. But we need to know. We cannot be ignorant, because ignorance will lead us into the trap that hundreds of millions have gone into when they followed John Nelson Darby. Now the early church had a John Nelson Darby. His name was Papias in the first 100 years. He was the only writer that I have heard of who had the Jewish myth of 1,000 years millennium with Christ ruling on earth. And then we have John Nelson Darby in our Christian world today, whose beliefs are followed all over the world by millions of people, and have been by millions of people for nearly 2 centuries. So that's a great diffusion of his beliefs worldwide. Herod the Great, who was there when Jesus was a baby and ordered all the children to be murdered because he wanted to murder Jesus Christ. He knew the Christ was born. You remember the story in Matthew's Gospel? He was a great architect and designer and builder. He built the temple, finished the temple that Jesus attended. And to gain the emperor's support, he died in AD 40 and was there about 20 years before. He built Caesarea by the sea that was there when Jesus was alive, was still there. And there were actually 3 temples that he built, but this was the main one. After the death of Jesus, the then Emperor Caligula ordered a statue of his image in the Holy of Holies in Israel's temple. And Tiberius called himself the Son of God. So they were all gods, not just Nero. And they considered themselves Caesars, dictators in perpetuity. Well, we all know what the dictator in North Korea is like. We knew what the dictator Stalin was like. We knew what the dictator Mussolini was like. And of course Hitler was never a dictator. If you know the history, or if you lived at that time, you'd know all about them. Well, I would say the Caesars were dictators that were, no worse than the dictator Stalin, but every bit as bad. And the worstness of it was that they had outward idolatry. Now we cannot remove the effect of this that would happen to the Christians. I know what happens to Christians in India, especially in the northern part. They're burnt to death many times. They're killed. Even down south it happens, but mostly in the north where it's predominantly Hindu and where the largest portion of the population lives. Killed, murdered, persecuted. The caste system. Terrible place. And that's what the Roman Empire was like. But nevertheless, the Roman Empire had a degree of civilization that doesn't exist in India. It was rather civilized. And so they're in this civilized heathen atmosphere. And the Caesars are blaspheming against God, against his name. And the people of the empire are doing the same thing when they worship the Caesars. And then they worshipped all the other gods as well. Like in India, hundreds of gods. Then in verse 7, after he had been given authority for 42 months, which is 3.5 years, that brings us to the Great Tribulation. That is in verse 5. The beast was given a mouth, uttering haughty and blasphemous words. And it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. The beast is the empire. Now the empire for those 42 months had, as Caesars, Nero, Vespasian, four others before Vespasian, then Vespasian. So you have 1, 4, 5, 1 or 6. 6 Caesars during that 3.5-year period. It's the beast who does it. The religious, demonic power behind the Roman Empire. You know, we look at empires today, we go to school and learn all about them, mostly good. These days I think they're taught bad things about the British Empire, but in my day it was always only good things. It's all gloss. It's a gloss. It's a golden painting that doesn't exist over the rottenness within. All empires are evil. You know, all governments are evil. We don't like to think that. We just see this hail fellow well met who comes and tries to get our votes on television or on the street or in the newspaper. We hear a little of the things that go on in Parliament. We don't hear the things that go on out of Parliament. All that goes on, all the lobbying, all the corruption, we don't hear most of it. It comes out every now and then. We don't like to think that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, because we don't want to think it about ourselves if we're not a Christian. We don't want to admit, I'm a sinner. And you can never find salvation if you do not come as a sinner to the Lord Jesus Christ. That's how serious it is. We're dealing with a God who has an eternal heaven and an eternal hell. We are dealing with a people of God under Christ whose enemy is Satan and all those principalities and powers who rule the world from up there in the supernatural part of the atmosphere, not from heaven. Heaven doesn't rule this world. Heaven rules the rulers of this world, put it that way, and allows them freedom, or maybe they do his will at certain times in their evil, because the judgments of God are in all the earth, and we don't like to think that. We just want to present God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. That's it. Now, that is a major way we get people saved. I've done it myself. But I'm beginning to think our preaching has been totally inadequate in the reaching of sinners. So we have half-baked Christians, Christians who follow heresy, Christians who follow the world, certainly in our Western countries. Now, from what I've seen of Indian Christians, they far exceed the Westerns in many ways. Without much knowledge, doesn't matter. Now, that's just an opinion. Only God knows. Only God is the judge. And we need to realize that the power of these gods, of these demons, rests in sexual perversion, number one. That's why it's so serious that our governments are passing gay marriage. Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed because of gay marriage, if they married, through homosexuality. Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed because the people did nothing except homosexuality. And whether they bred children or not, I really don't know. Haven't gone into that. It's the political power of the Roman Empire. It was its sexual perversions that were a multitude. What about the virgins of Ephesus? Now, virgins in a temple are there, called virgins because they enter the temples as virgins, but they don't remain virgins. They're either the tools of the priests alone, or the tools of the male worshippers, or even the female worshippers. They're not virgins any longer. Look, we need to realize this was the cesspool of iniquity that these churches lived among and had to endure and stay true to Christ. And we're not only dealing with the Roman Empire, even in this chapter, because it mentions 42 months. We're dealing with the Great Tribulation that did not come upon the Roman Empire. It came upon Palestine and Jerusalem. The Great Tribulation was not worldwide. The Great Tribulation was 42 months in Jerusalem and Palestine. If you read your history, you'll know that. There was no 42 months of Great Tribulation in the rest of the Roman Empire. In fact, the wars were centered around the Jews, because for many a year the Jews have kept on revolting. Even Jesus spoke of it. Simon the Zealot, I think he mentioned. He was really a robber and an opposer with arms against the Roman Empire. So we need to understand that this is the background of all of the book of Revelation, and certainly of chapter 13. And in verse 7, it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. Now this is the beast. It had authority for 42 months against Palestine and the Jews. There is no record of any authority that was unusual for the 42 months, or the 3.5 years, during which the Great Tribulation continued in Palestine and Jerusalem until AD 70, August. When Jerusalem fell, the same day on which it had fallen, the same day and month of the year, not the year, on which Jerusalem had fallen to Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon. Babylon had fallen again. Only this time Babylon was Jerusalem. And indeed Jerusalem was a Babylon in those days, if you read the book of Isaiah and Jeremiah and even Ezekiel. But now there is, in verse 7, it was allowed to make war on the saints. It doesn't say where these saints were. They were all around the Roman Empire because it's the beast. And the beast is over multitudes of people all around halfway around the world. Incidentally, there was a true church of Jesus Christ, at least 7 that I know of, 7.5, that were in Kerala, India at this time. Because St. Thomas went there, and he was long gone, martyred by the Brahmins on Mount Thomas that's in Chennai today. We have gone up there. There's a Roman Catholic little church there relating the event inside, in which we entered also. So, what happened to those Christians? Well, I don't know. I don't know the record of what went on there. But you see, it was not part of the Roman Empire. You get the picture? They may not have had the persecution that they did under the Roman Empire. But it says in verse 8, all the inhabitants of the earth will worship it. What earth? Not India. Not South Africa. Not America. Not South America. Or North America. They didn't have those names in those days. Not China. Not Indonesia. They were not part of the Roman Empire. It's talking about the people of the Roman Empire worshipping the beast, and it is said, all the earth. Now we have explained, as it says here, in verse 8, all the inhabitants of the earth. The earth also in Greek means a certain segment, a few nations. So it was not the whole world as we know it. It was the Roman Empire. And everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of the life of the Lamb that was slaughtered or slain. So in particular, this beast is making war on the saints, and then when this happens, all the rest of the inhabitants who are not saints, in some form or other, worship the beast. Now it is not said that it's because the Christians are slain, but it stands to reason it had a big import on the Gentile or unbelieving world. The Gentiles are the unbelievers. They would see these thousands and thousands and thousands of Christians slain. And what would the effect be? They're not Christians. Although I heard a story once of a Roman legion that was involved in causing the martyrdom of some Christians. And when one of the soldiers in the Roman legion saw how they rejoiced in going to their death, he actually said publicly, "I am now a Christian," and they martyred him. Now, I heard that story many years ago. But generally, all the heathen, when they saw it happen, they said, "This is a great empire. Our Caesar is the greatest of gods." They said, "This empire has so many gods. They're all so powerful. These Christians who claim their God is Jesus have no power at all. They're all dying." That is what was going on according to this verse. And these verses are somewhat prophetic. They're not prophetic of the end time. They're prophetic of what was about to happen. These scenes were about to happen. And so John is giving, by the instructions of Christ from God through the angel, these revelations that come from heaven into the hearts of the believers of the seven churches, because they were in the center of great evil and of great persecution that would come, and of where the seat of Satan was. They needed to be forewarned. Then we come to verse 11. We'll deal with that now. Or we better do verse 9. Verse 9, "Let anyone who has an ear to hear, listen. If you are to be taken captive, into captivity you go. If you kill with the sword you must be killed." Now some scholars think that that was just inserted and it should not be there. It almost seems to me that for the first bit, that it relates to the Christians. If you're determined by God to be taken captive, you will be taken captive. I'm not sure about that. Or if you kill with the sword you must be killed. Some say that's Nero. Well, I think that's a lot of rubbish. So as far as those two verses 9 and 10 are concerned, well, my advice is don't worry about them. You will never come to a conclusive answer. So something that does not have a conclusive answer, let it be. Get onto the parts of the Bible that have a conclusive answer, or parts of the Bible that you really see are the truth. Major on them. That's the wisest thing to do. Now in verse 11, I saw another beast that rose out of the earth, not the sea. It had 2 horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. Now what was the dragon? The dragon was a religious symbol, and here we have a symbol of a beast that has a religious content. It has 2 horns like a lamb, as if in mockery of Jesus Christ, the Lamb of God. But it spoke like a dragon. It's an antichrist spirit, not the Antichrist. Certainly an antichrist spirit that dares to have 2 horns like a lamb. And it spoke like a dragon, which is the religious authority of the Roman Empire. And it had all the authority of the first beast on its behalf. In other words, the Roman Empire says to this part of the Roman Empire, that I think was about 10 areas of religiosity, it said, you have all authority to make the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound had been healed. Now the mortal wound is on the beast here, not on the head. So the mortal wound affects the beast, who is the Roman Empire. And this myth of Nero, who was the head, who had a mortal wound, the myth of Nero affected the whole of the Roman Empire, because it was a common belief. The Roman historians mention it, more than one Roman historian. Now in verse 13, this religious body performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in the sight of all. Now most scholars take the position that it's not actual fire, it's just something that is rather unusual or so forth. I don't believe so. Having lived in India and been there year in and year out, I know the power of the occult. And I know the power of Satanism. And actually, as Christians, we need to know the power of the demonic forces that are against us, because we tread it all along the garden path as if there's nothing around that's going to hurt us while we pick the daisies and have a good time. But we need to know. We cannot be ignorant, because ignorance will lead us into the trap that hundreds of millions have gone into when they followed John Nelson Darby.